Luke Nichter, author of The Year That Broke Politics. Welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So, Luke, I think the exciting thing I want to start with is that I've always loved, when many reasons I do this podcast is because I'm a natural student and, many years a student of American history. When I first learned about 1968, it was in about 1993 in any meaningful way in an amazing course I took in my undergraduate years, which is to say that there was a lot of information we did not know about 1968 at that time, or as you describe it, conventional wisdom might be different. Before we start, I wanted to read this from your book in the introduction to give people an idea and guide us through this conversation about what you mean here about the year that sort of broke politics and also changed history. You write, the nation was fractured. Socially, our communities were divided in response to racial upheaval in our cities. We struggled to find the right balance between allowing protest and maintaining law and order. The United States seemed to have reached the limit of its means to pay for both social progress and the war. The economic warning lights, including slower growth and rising inflation, were blinking red. Our armed forces were spread around the world, and few issues were more divisive than the draft that forced our young into combat. The old politics seemed to have run out of answers. The Cold War had reached a turning point, headed toward an unknown destination. The post-war era of American dominance was ending, and the West was being eclipsed by the rise of a hostile and threatening East. Let's use that as a portal in before we get into the amazing revelations in this book. Get readers a little bit acquainted. Let's go into 1968, which I think is weirdly, not entirely dissimilar from our own crazy time.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a lot there, we could go into. I think look, I just came from the classroom here at Chapman University, and I think the most that Americans ever know, if anything, is about ourselves. We tend to put ourselves, our own history, at the center of world history. We assume we are the most important actor. And so 1968 is sort of shorthand for one of these years of revolution in American and world history. But I think what Americans don't know is how much of these sorts of activities and upheaval that you were describing were really taking place right around the globe in 1968. So we know it as sort of a culmination of this tumultuous, disorderly decade called the 1960s. This is the way I present it to people who are 18, 19, 20 years old these days. But really, whether you look at the Chinese Cultural Revolution, whether you look at apartheid in South Africa, whether you look at, student movements on the left bank in Paris, you could look almost anywhere and see similar kinds of upheavals, sometimes for different reasons, were going on right around the globe. So I sort of start for the audience by sort of situating what might be sort of a common story for Americans within a much broader context.
Right. So for those that are unaware, and again, all of this is in the book, but just as, again, another broad stroke, in 1968, here are some key events. We have the Tet Offensive in February of 68. We have March 31st of 68, LBJ announces he's not going to run for re-election, plagued by problems with the Vietnam War and anti-war protests. April 4th of 1968, Dr. King is shot in Memphis by James Earl Ray. June of 68, Bobby Kennedy is killed by Sirhan Sirhan in LA right after winning the California primary. That in July, I believe it was, the Soviet Union invades Czechoslovakia. All of this going along against the backdrop of peace talks that were both in Honolulu and Paris. So these were, seismic events for a nation to go through. Oh, of course, the Democratic Convention famously, where protesters clashed with the police, where Hubert Humphrey, LBJ's vice president, would eventually be the nominee, trying to lead a very fractured Democratic Party. Through each of these events, and there's a lot in there, I think that the most interesting thing about the book is this conversation you had with former Vice President Walter Mondale in 2017. So let's go into that and from a domestic political, for the purposes of this domestic political discussion, tell everybody about that conversation, because I thought that was amazing.
Yeah. So, one of the things I'm proudest about this book is that I feel like I don't really take a side. My goal was really to cover the four sides fairly equal. In terms of even similar page count in the book. When I talk about the four sides, of course, Johnson, Humphrey, Nixon, and Wallace. I spent a lot of time with those families and former staff, not once, but wanted to be able to go back to them more than once. And, maybe you have to be a dirty moderate to borrow from you to be able to be considered an honest enough broker with this sort of delicate history to be able to do that with people who really were seared by it personally in many cases. These aren't just things they read about in a textbook. These are things they were on the front lines of political combat for those years. And so I was just making the rounds to the Humphrey side of this sort of the Humphrey quadrant, if you will, and lots of trips to Minneapolis, the Twin Cities, to look at records primarily. But on one particular visit, I was there to do some interviews. And so I had met former Vice President Walter Mondale at his law firm in downtown Minneapolis, thinking that we were going to have a conversation about his recollections of 68. And to be completely candid, I didn't expect to get a lot out of him, not because most of his political career came later. And so when you're talking to a politician about an earlier period before they became kind of a household name, sometimes they can be surprisingly quiet because what they really want to talk about is when they ran for president in the 1980s or when they were vice president in the late 1970s. And so I was surprised when he started to go down this rabbit hole to say, because he was for listeners, he was the co-chair of Humphrey's campaign in 68, along with Senator Fred Harris. But a lot of times these co-chairs are really more symbolic. You want big names on the masthead, on the letterhead, so to speak. A campaign might have numerous co-chairs. And so that doesn't always mean their role was substantive. And so what I didn't know, and I'd known that much because I read his memoir, which came out I think the year or two before. I saw him in late 2017. What I didn't know was this rabbit hole he went down in our conversation saying, in the 70s, I became very close to Hubert Humphrey. He said, we talked about 68 many times. We talked about his own career. He helped me to negotiate my duties as vice president in the Carter administration because I think he wanted me to avoid some of the trouble that he had as Lyndon Johnson's vice president. I could tell there was a relationship there that had not really been adequately.
Of course, Humphrey, when Humphrey became Johnson's VP, Mondale took that Senate seat. Isn't that right? He became.
That's right. Right. No, and they were from sort of the same branch of the Democratic Party.
Democratic Farmer Labor tradition.
At DFL, the Democratic Farmer Labor wing of that party, which is kind of a unique, I call them kind of a prairie progressive wing of the upper Midwest.
You talked about this in your book of the Democratic Party and the farmer labor movement. And then politically, in my lifetime, I only know them. You think Minnesota blue, DFL, I mean, Minnesota famously was the only state Ronald Reagan never carried and hasn't gone for a Republican in presidential politics since 1972.
Yes.
Anyway.
Well, and it's this, really a small strain of the party, but it really produced big figures from Hubert Humphrey to Walter Mondale, and probably today Amy Klobuchar is the most direct descendant of this strain. She actually interned in Mondale's office in the early 1980s when she was a young woman. Wow. So that's kind of that strain, and it's an important strain, not just in the party's history, but in American history.
Okay.
And so he started to go down this rabbit hole of, I knew Humphrey pretty well in the 1970s, and we talked about 68 a lot. And he was allowing me to conclude that he sort of understood almost as if I was talking to Humphrey himself, that he understood what Humphrey also thought about that year. So at one point, I just had to come out and ask him and say, so what do you think? So do you think that outgoing President Lyndon Johnson wanted his vice president, Hubert Humphrey, to win or not in 68? Mm-hmm. Because, of course, the whole literature, other than a couple of recent books, says, of course, why would you not want your own vice president to carry on your policies and your political legacy? And Mondale thought very differently. He said, absolutely not. He said, absolutely not. And so I didn't know how to follow up. And I'm a historian, not a journalist. I don't do interviews for a living. And so it's that tension where you have that awkward silence. And how soon do I go in and kind of rescue him? Or how do you follow up after something that's very different than what the whole shelves of books that have been written about the 68 election? And I said, so what do you mean? So do you think Johnson actually wanted Nixon to win, his longtime nemesis in politics? And Mondale, we were sitting at the very end of a long conference table you would find in I guess a law firm or a university setting. He was at the head of the table at the one end, and I was just to his right on the corner. And he sort of gazed far down the long end of the table as if he was looking at someone, but we were the only ones in the room. And he kind of gazed. It seemed like it was 5 minutes, but it was probably 10 seconds or 20 seconds. And then he returned his focus to me and he said, maybe. And then he went on to explain that this is a productive area for you to look into. Is it possible for us to document what Lyndon Johnson's mindset actually was in 68 and how it evolved over the chaos of that year? And so I felt in a way like that was my charge in the book, not writing 1,000-page kind of doorstop, but to really write more of a 50-year retrospective to see kind of what's new, what new do I have to add to the story? And as you say, right front and center is this point of departure here with former Vice President Mondale.
Right. I mean, the interesting thing also about your book, what I thought was very, again, thank you for saying it, dirty moderate about it, despite how well written it is and how well researched it is, the conventional wisdom has always been that, Nixon really was nothing but a scoundrel. Johnson was damaged by the Vietnam War. Hubert Humphrey was sort of not robbed because the election was stolen, but cheated out of the presidency, which he should have had because Nixon was so evil. George Wallace, who I'm not a fan of, has always been painted with a caricature brush, and even the detail you expose about, the damage that the NLF, National Liberation Front, and Viet Cong were doing to American personnel, even when we were trying to work toward ceasefires. In retrospect, it seems like it was the wrong thing to do, but you can understand being there at the time, having to protect American troops and people on the ground. A lot of that stuff was never presented in the way you present it. I think a lot of it's a testament to the archives opening, if you will, and your, dedication to the research, time going by, but also, presenting a nuanced view of it, especially reminding people things like, Richard Nixon, of course he was a politician, but he was a Lincoln Republican. He was an NAACP liberal. Johnson was the segregationist racist who, bucked the party, his own party, and used with Republican support to get the civil rights bills passed, but that, there was a respect that Johnson had for Nixon as a former vice president, someone he also served with in the House and Senate, someone who he saw as a really smart political leader. None of this is because I'm now praising one side or the other, but it's to sort of clarify, though I was gobsmacked to see, hey, Johnson wanted Nixon to win. I had heard about him not getting along with Humphrey. I love the book you described their final sort of moment before the election, screaming at each other after swigging all that scotch, although Johnson was, drink eternally, and Humphrey was 5 sheets to the wind. But all of this is to say that I think it's important because, your subtitle is Collusion and Chaos, and there was a lot of chaos, and there was a lot of jockeying and Machiavellian things that were happening, and politics ain't beanbag, as someone once taught me. It's complicated, and learning about Nixon wanting to kind of respect, maybe even arguably continue the Johnson legacy is a fascinating part. Talk about that. We're going to talk also about Billy Graham being so pivotal here, and his diaries coming open after 70 or 80 years that you were able to look at his relationship with all presidents from Truman to Obama. But let's just break it down. This whole Nixon-Johnson relationship, Johnson kind of in a non-aggression pact with Nixon, by the end, everybody was both candidates. Nixon, Humphrey, Wright were running as on halt the bombing, but there was a lot of behind-the-scenes stuff going on. So let's just go through some of that.
Yeah, I certainly for this program and for your audience, I think they would catch on to really what's some of the questions that are really behind the book, even if they're not asked explicitly. And I think the most important one is really, when you look at politics and for me, it's like kabuki theater. I'm sitting in the cheap seats and I'm looking at actors on a stage, but I don't really know how it works. I see it's public facing manifestation, but I don't really know what really goes on behind the scenes to influence what I'm seeing. And so what I'm saying is, I think one of the most important questions, really more implicit in the book, is what if at important moments in history, politics is not what we've been told? And to me, that's a fascinating question that you can apply to different periods in history. But, I think in terms of 68, how that's applied is the chaos and the events every month that unfolded that you described. We've all heard stories of millions of Americans experience the Chicago Convention from their living rooms, watching the violence on TV, and the police participate and in some ways encourage, that violence. The question really about 68 is what happens when that chaos affects even the highest echelons of the political establishment? And does it alter their political behavior, even if it's been ingrained for decades? And so in this case, Johnson and Nixon are political legends. They're each masters of their own party. I think they had faced each other in contentious battles, policy, and on the ballot for a generation. I mean, you look at, Nixon was on the ballot in every national election from 52 to 72, with the exception of 64, where he wanted to be, but it just didn't come together right in the Goldwater insurgency. I mean, these are people that, a bit like our own political era, it's difficult to find people then who don't have an opinion about the things that they're observing. And so Johnson and Nixon were the ultimate rivals, at each other's throats. And so where I come in 50 years later, usually after people have moved on to other subjects and maybe there's less interest, is it often takes about 50 years. It used to be more like 30, but it seems it's more like 50 now for the records to become opened, for everybody to be gone typically, and for us to really have a more dispassionate look at a contentious, controversial, complex period and try to figure out what in the world went on. And so, addition to the Graham stuff that you said we'll get into, I would also point to Lady Bird Johnson's diary. Those have also
very pivotal. Thank you, and I loved reading them and seeing her as his muse, protector, and really almost not as co-president, but she was a co-pilot more than we knew, right?
Or a chief of staff or something. I mean, just really a kind of jack of all trades. I mean, cheerleader, but also critic at times. Yeah. And that's one of the sources for me that got me thinking, we, the members of the public, don't really have access to kind of the behind the curtain of that kabuki theater. And her diary began to provide that a little bit. I'll give you one example. March of 1966, the rich political ritual of the Washington Gridiron in D.C. every year in the springtime. Her diary entry for that day records that she walks into Johnson's bedroom. He had a separate bedroom in the White House. And this is a Sunday morning. And she says something like, I'm loosely paraphrasing, but this is very close. You never know who you find in Lyndon's bedroom. And today it was Richard Nixon. I mean, a place where confidants would visit who out of the gaze of the West Wing and the press corps. And I think, he would come in and they would have a kind of, whether you want to say non-aggression pact, agree to the political rules of engagement, in this case for the coming midterms. That source, the Graham diary, and the few others in here really showed me there's something else going on here.
Yeah, I mean, and the role of Billy Graham, who, I remember certainly in my lifetime always kind of looming around, as you write, he's a self-described independent. He did back Nixon, but he had a great in 68, but he had great relationships with many presidents, as I said, from Truman on. Talk about his role as a kind of between Johnson and Nixon in fostering this pact, but also in this curious way that he was an involved person in this presidential race. I learned a lot from that.
Yeah, I think the Reverend Billy Graham has the potential to be the most important person in the 1968 election who's either not the outgoing president or on the ballot that year in terms of Nixon, Humphrey, and Wallace. Graham is fascinating for a number of reasons. He's from North Carolina. So, and he's a sort of call it moderate Southern Democrat. I mean, pro-civil rights.
Right.
At his crusade rallies, even in segregated parts of the country, in segregated venues, he never followed the rules. He never allowed his audiences, his choirs, his band members to be segregated. And I don't know that anyone really pushed back on him because he's the only figure in American society for decades who can draw crowds larger than a U.S. president. So presidents, I mean, in some ways, presidents looked up to him for how to conduct advance, how to conduct rallies, how to use media to your. I mean, it's incredible the influence he had way beyond just the evangelical world. And so in '68, he was really closest to Lyndon Johnson, kind of a fellow moderate Southerner, pro-civil rights, kind of from the fringes of the South. I mean, someone from the deep South wouldn't really consider either Lyndon Johnson or Billy Graham to be a true Southerner, but he was kind of close at a time when the votes of millions of those Americans kind of on the fringes of the South were beginning to come into play and possibly be up for grabs in '68. And so Graham, he had an affection for Lyndon Johnson. He believed Johnson should run and win, but he understood why, and was one of the only ones Johnson consulted with that he wouldn't run. But Graham also believed that Nixon had lost narrowly in '60 and more decisively in '62 for the California governorship. He was still a young man in his 40s, and he thought he deserved a second chance. He would get another chance. And so Graham's loyalties were divided between the current President Johnson, who he loved, and Nixon, who he thought, deserved redemption. And Graham said, if they run against each other, I don't know what I'm going to do because I love them both as brothers. And so then when Johnson drops out of the race on March 31st, he goes fully behind Nixon. And so what you see unfold, I believe it's the first book that features Graham's diaries. And so 2 months after I met Mondale in December of '17, to my surprise, Billy Graham died at age 99 in February of 2018. Right. And he leaves behind, I mean, almost like a presidential library volume of records that we're going to be going through for decades. Right. 70 years of political papers, 50 some volumes of diaries with presidents from Truman to Obama, containing verbatim conversations that are not anywhere else that I know of. And so they allowed me to see just the '68 portion, which is what I cared about. And I would call Graham kind of a back channel. I call the chapter messenger in one case, a liaison, whatever term you want to use. He was a go-between between all of the major figures that summer.
Right. In going through some of the figures, I think it's obviously people may forget that George Wallace, 4 times elected governor of Alabama, originally considered himself something of a moderate and famously lost in '56, I think it was, in Alabama. Never wanted to see that happen again. I'm not going to use the word he said, but he never said he'd be out beep again in the South. Segregation now, segregation forever. Obviously, he has a villainous image in history for a lot of reasons. I know, for those that don't know, when he ran again in '72, he was assassinated by a guy named Arthur Bremer, left paralyzed from the waist down. And some people think that began his repentance. I don't know, because he came back to the governorship in Alabama in the '80s as sort of a friend of the civil rights community. Still a Democrat, interestingly, old-time Southern Democrat, but a different kind in that way. Bringing the Wallace equation to this, I think, is very relevant to our history, our understanding of our politics, our political history, and to the audiences listening to this and to readers everywhere. George Wallace wins 13.5% of the vote. He's the last independent candidate to win states in the Electoral College. I think it was 6. Was that right?
Yeah, he won. I believe it was 46 Electoral College votes is the big one, because even Ross Perot polled as high as 39% in '92, but he didn't win any votes, Electoral College votes. And we talk about the popular vote, but we have to remember presidential elections, until we modify this, are settled in the Electoral College, and Wallace was really the last successful one on that score.
So you detail how Wallace, conventional wisdom always had it that Wallace, because he was a Democrat, hurt Humphrey by splitting the vote. But in truth, he really was taking away the more right-leaning or right-wing populist part of Nixon's coalition, if anything. And Nixon was able to drive a middle lane right through Humphrey being soft on law and order, soft on crime. Same issues that have plaguing the Democrats. Really, '68 began that, if you think about it, and it's been an issue for a long time. And then, Nixon was able to drive a line through that. And Wallace, who was too extreme, was appealing to, the more rabid elements of Southern racism and stuff like that. But he is a precursor and forerunner and seed planter of what you could say is MAGA in so many ways.
Yep.
In the anger at the system, you point out, to take nothing away from his racist campaigns, that he was tapping into a kind of grievance, that we live under, this populist grievance, which, by the way, if you were to ideologically categorize Wallace, right, he in many ways was economically more liberal and socially to the right, because he was a New Deal Democrat. He believed that government could do what it needed to do. He wasn't opposing social programs, but he was more culturally conservative, and a little bit like MAGA. I mean, Trump doesn't believe in anything, but insofar as he does, the Republicans aren't really running, even though some of their budgets say that it will. They're not really running against slashing and burning government. They're running on using government for their own ends and, fighting for the little guys. So talk about the sort of Wallace movement and how you think that connects to today's politics.
Yeah, I find 68 to be a surprisingly good roadmap, to today's politics. Of course, the people are different. Yeah. The configuration of the parties and politics are a little bit different. But I think Wallace really resonates to this year, 2024, and more recently for a couple different reasons. One, if you look at even the campaign these days of Robert Kennedy Jr., he's following the Wallace playbook in terms of how do you get on the ballot as a third party candidate. Wallace wanted to run on a third party, even though he considered himself a lifelong Democrat, because he wanted to criticize both parties. He was unhappy with different things about both parties. And so I think he ran in 68. I would call his campaign in 68 the first kind of full bore effort to run an anti-establishment, anti-elite, anti-media campaign. Right. And he got on the ballot in all 50 states, which is impossible to do. Right. And so that's the first thing. And the second thing I would say, while Wallace made his earlier incendiary statements about race in 62 and 63, right, as I show in the book, if you go back and actually look at what Wallace was saying in 68, what the press covering him were saying about it, he really wasn't talking about race. He didn't recant or apologize for those earlier statements. He just talked about them less and less. And if you were one of those voters,
well, it was also 4 years. I would argue, though, and again, I can't get in his head, maybe you know this for sure, argue that, the passage of the Civil and Voting Rights Act, the end of de jure segregation at the federal level, even though it was always an issue and motivated eventually many Democrats become Republicans over this, but they, 4 years later, it was by no means, peaceful, but the riots and all the aftermath was allowed him to use Law and Order, I think, as a cover in a lot of ways, to take nothing away from the parts of the message that I think real people believed in.
To your point, I mean, it was a statute by that point. Whether Civil Rights Act was 64, Voting Rights Act of 65, there was a 68.
In other words, Lyndon Johnson had signed the Civil Rights Act and then swept to re-election over Barry Goldwater too. So it's not, I think that again, these issues never go away. They were fresh, but I think Wallace had to portray them differently. Would be my instinct. I might be wrong on that, but I think that was,
And I just think that by 68 and in the 68 form, I think one of the lessons here about history is that these figures we're talking about, they're not static. They evolve. They're reacting to events at home and abroad. And I think by 68, as I argue in the book, Wallace is really, if you look at what he was saying, articulating more of a class-based message, not a race-based. And he's going after those blue-collar, that lower middle class, those traditional FDR Truman Democrats, really, which is what he was. And I don't think that he certainly didn't inspire the grievances that this class had, but he certainly knew how to manipulate those grievances, Absolutely. Which is something different.
Yeah, no, very much so. And I think you see some of Nixon's later political success in 72 when he ran against McGovern, who was so left. He brought in a 49 state victory, a lot of the hard hats and the working class grievances, because Wallace wasn't on the table. He ran, but he didn't, it was really a two-way race then. But to that point, the world seemed like the wheels were coming off of it, and I guess you could say that about any era. America's always been fractious in a lot of ways, obviously, intrinsically and otherwise. But, the pain of what had become Vietnam and the explosion of racial and civil unrest at this time, especially the Democratic Convention and after the death of Dr. King, people saw a country paralyzed at war and paralyzed at home. And so Law and Order, I thought the book did this very well, which has historically been used to sort of say that all Republicans post-Nixon used that as a kind of encoded racist message. I think both things are true. I think it was a grievance stoking for a certain sect, but I also think that the vast majority of Americans, like we're seeing today with, what I believe are absurd campus protests on the wrong side of history and vandalizing and burning American flags, I just don't think, I don't even think Americans are not okay with it. Turns out a new poll today shows that 90% of college students think that blocking Jewish kids' entry to a classroom is not okay, or that only 20%, a little less than 20% of the students on campus even support the protest. That's fascinating, because, and I'm saying this all to say that 1968, right, you have a president who doesn't run for re-election because of the quagmire of Vietnam. You've got Nixon, who is establishment, but who's able to tap into an unease in the country, but yet command leadership. And then you've got Wallace, right, who's looking to, in many ways, burn it all down. Now, he was damaged by Curtis LeMay, his running mate, too. I don't think he ever would have won. But tell everybody a little bit about LeMay, the World War II guy, and some of his, liabilities. I think that's interesting. For those that don't know, okay, so Nixon chose Governor Spiro Agnew of Maryland as his running mate. He was kind of a more moderate Republican. Humphrey was running with Edmund Muskie of Maine. May remember he cried on the campaign trail 4 years later. He was eventually Carter's Secretary of State. And then Wallace chose this guy, Curtis LeMay.
Curtis LeMay, who is lampooned as bombs away LeMay. LeMay, right. Actually, he's a complex figure who probably deserves more nuanced treatment in some ways. And I say that because he certainly was not a Wallace supporter, typical. I mean, he was retired in West LA. He'd already pledged his support to Nixon. He did not want to enter politics, thought that was beneath him. LeMay is probably famous for being, if anything, he's called a warmonger. The bombing of Japan during World War II, which Wallace was part of some of those missions. So, they had, I don't know that they knew each other going back then, but certainly knew of, General Curtis LeMay. And then during the Kennedy years, he's often, it's like these films like Dr. Strangelove, where it's almost like LeMay is the one with like the finger hovering right over the button, and we don't want our these types of weapons to be in the hands of these types of military leaders. But in a way, let me be a dirty moderate for a second. I think LeMay, in a sense, probably did more than almost anyone to make sure the World War III that was prophesied by the political establishment, the thing that everyone feared, didn't happen during the Cold War. The one who helped to bring us to the brink during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the closest the Cold War probably ever became to a hot war, and made sure that didn't happen. Yeah. So LeMay, I think the deeper you look, it's harder to stereotype him or almost to caricature him, which is really what he's been in history. So in 68, he's retired, he's happy, he's also a heart patient. He doesn't need to go back into combat, any kind of combat. And LeMay, on the other hand, Wallace needs a running mate. I think Wallace was a one-man show. He didn't want a running mate. And what he found, as I think Robert Kennedy found this year, that to get on the ballots in some states, there's all these hurdles to go through, not just the number of signatures or the filing fees or the things that we expect to happen, but in some cases, you need to have had a convention. You need to have had a platform issued publicly. You need to have a running mate. And so Wallace was these hurdles were coming at him so quickly. And, he was having people stand in as a running mate who had no intention of being a running mate in some cases. And so he needed to settle this issue. And so he didn't figure it out really until September, October of 68, much later than the other two political parties. He needed to name someone. And I think LeMay became convinced of Wallace's message. I wouldn't say go so far as say Wallace thought we could fight and win in Vietnam, but that he would turn the management of the war, take it from the politicians, give it back to the military commanders, and let them fight this battle the way that they think, untie their hands as they see it that have been tied since the Kennedy years. And I think also that LeMay was really the only one sort of, it's a bit like Trump, kind of saying what he really thinks, like saying it as it is. And that resonated with a lot of people, going back to your early point, who felt that no one in politics was giving them a voice in the process. Right. And so whether you liked him, whether you were from Alabama or the South, or really fit this stereotype of a Wallace supporter, he gave you a voice that you didn't have. And that was a big part of his support. And so LeMay brought a kind of gravitas, military experience, a foreign policy record that Wallace didn't have. But it was just if he could do it all over again, I'm assuming neither Wallace nor LeMay would make that decision again.
No, I mean, I think also, an overarching point of your book, too, is that the sort of New Deal coalition, as it was known among Democrats, which, of course, famously included the Deep South, began with the election of Roosevelt in 32. Really, in 68 is a major turning point. It is an inflection point in history in a lot of ways, in a lot of years like that, but a lot like 2016, where the Republican Party, by nominating Donald Trump, became a completely different entity. Of course, it might have been going there. It comes out of the Tea Party. You can trace history. My point in saying all this is that, 68, law and order becomes prime, a prime issue. Vietnam begins to test the faith of Americans, followed by, comes later, of course, with Watergate. By the 70s, which have a lot of economic problems and lead to the election of Ronald Reagan. Again, Nixon winning in 68, very narrowly narrowly in the popular vote. The Electoral College usually was like 302 to 191, so it actually isn't as narrow as people think. Again, targeted in select states. Now, later elections got bigger again before they went back to swing states like they are now. But 68's Nixon, 72 Nixon's reelected. You get Carter for the 4 years, but other than that, I mean, I'm born in 74. Bill Clinton was only the second Democrat to be elected in my lifetime when he got in 92, because 68 is Nixon twice, and then other than Carter, you got Reagan, Bush, and obviously it's alternated more frequently since then. But there is this sea change the book talks about, but it also nuances things that in our own historical era of misinformation, people would never think of, how Nixon's support of Johnson's administration from a sort of like do no harm approach, right? And as Humphrey was his opponent, he was still like, they had this alliance, Nixon-Johnson. Nixon then kind of in a lot of ways continues a lot of Johnson era policies. He's amazing on China. A lot of this is to the ire of his right flank, who had known him as this sort of red baiter and the young conservative supposedly chosen by Eisenhower. He ends up EPA, OSHA, affirmative action and contracting. Obviously, the opening to Mao was a big deal. Showing Nixon was always a great pragmatist. If he hadn't been so pathological, he would have been one of the great presidents, because he was so smart and so visionary. And I think that there's a whole sum up of that there, as it relates to your book, because I think your history, talks about how politics got broken, and as a result of that, and it's very prevalent now, but people have been unable to make sense of things in these binary ways they want to study history in, and I think that's not good. I think I'm sure it's
and every
professor to try to push through this, and other people where, oh my God, Nixon's evil. Okay, well, Johnson, well, we liked him because of Medicare, but he killed a lot of Americans. They're just it's the thing about dirty moderate, right? Like I'm saying, we have to look at each of these things unto themselves and really peel back the layers and analyze these things in a context and, with hopefully historical meaning, so.
Well, and I would add, we're both kids of the 70s. So I think the result of that is, I think often, especially complex, controversial subjects aren't usually written by the participants.
No.
Because you don't have the right perspective. I mean, whether you worked in the Nixon White House and were a defender, or whether you were drafted to Vietnam or seared on a college campus at that time period and tried to avoid the draft, that doesn't make you necessarily the best qualified to write the lasting history of a time period.
No.
And so, the work of a historian is flawed because, of course, we're sitting in archives and we're looking at records and trying to figure out, okay, what really happened? And this led to this. And of course, a lot of things don't end up in records. They end up in fireplaces, or you have to interview people. It's a flawed process. But I feel like that first generation of history, at least on Nixon, really almost caricatures him as this figure who crawls out of the sewer every 4 years and campaigns for something. When, at least you look at 68, and I would say Nixon is so much has been said about, he doesn't talk about Vietnam, he must have a secret plan. Or by May, he's proposing, I would say, kind of like a great society, but shaded in a more pro-market Republican way, as I say in the book. So he's not talking about massive social welfare programs. He's talking instead about things like black tax cuts, right, or community policing, or encouraging businesses to private investment in cities. So he's not talking about reducing the spending. And of course, the size of the government under the Nixon presidency doesn't shrink after LBJ's Great Society. It grows. Oh, yeah. And it just grows in different ways. And so I think, this overarching argument, as Nixon is like the ultimate paranoid partisan politician, when you're looking for an example on Wikipedia, I think one of the lessons of the Nixon presidency in that era is actually he wasn't very partisan in a lot of ways, because it was really only since Nixon, those presidents who've been probed or gone through impeachment have learned that you got to take care of your base, and you better be more partisan than Nixon was. The people who were upset the most at Nixon's presidency, I would say, were the establishment, which is both sides of the party, because both parties. He wasn't one of them. He never was. He looked down on them. He ran against them, a bit like a Wallace or a Trump, and the media. But also, a lot of his programs, as you enumerated, really, it was traditional conservative Republicans who went giddily over the cliff with Goldwater in 64, for whom Nixon and Lodge in 60 were too liberal for them. And he came back in 68, I think somewhere in between Nixon of 60 and Goldwater of 64, still too far to the left for clean air, clean water, endangered species, Wilderness Act. I mean, you could go on and on and on. And I think it really shows that what Nixon always was is exactly what you would expect as someone who came out of the Earl Warren lane of the Republican Party, who had always been on the side of what I call in my class, the moderate to liberal internationalists of the 1940s. But that's common sense to you and me, but that's not in the literature. What we're talking about here is really cutting edge in history, because a lot of these ideas aren't really documented yet, because it's taken 50 years to have a better perspective to go back and look at that time.
Well, but just to sort of end here, or sort of draw full circle to our close of the conversation, that's right. The archives are open. You're teaching it, but it shows that, and even in this era, a lot of people in the work I do have a hard time understanding why or how they should get out of their own lane, their partisan silos. They've made judgments on both sides of parties of things they're not even aware of, which is why history, the kind of presidential history you're talking about, and the time it takes to learn it is so important. One of the things we knew in 1993 was Eisenhower had reconciled himself, and he was always a moderate too, to the New Deal when he got in there. Much like Nixon reconciled himself to the Great Society, maybe with a different tint, a different flavor. But these were not revolutionaries. Do you know what I mean? These were people that were accommodationists. They were pragmatists, and that Wallace's fervor, which in many ways you could trace through a lot to Pat Buchanan and later life, his candidacies, and subsequently to Donald Trump, were sort of the seedlings of the people now who, I think are too extreme because they want to burn it down, and I think the partisan biases that have existed, have been much to America's detriment. So it's very important for your book to be read, because you see, whether you like it or not, how much Johnson admired Nixon, or how much he may have not thought Humphrey was right, or how Humphrey, was too principled about things, or maybe a little too soft, and, how Wallace, was ahead of his skis and made a lot of caustic remarks, but also spoke to people who were not being heard. And those are things which have to be said. in the reckoning or judgment of history. What do you say?
Yeah, I think one of the lessons of this book is, this era of modern populism that we look at now. Populists on both sides of the aisle have borrowed from that Wallace playbook.
Yeah.
I think more recently and more recognizable, it's on the Republican side of the aisle because of Donald Trump.
Yeah.
But these are, you trace them back, these are originally Democrats, blue collar labor members, FDR, Truman Democrats. And the irony is that I think they still are mostly Democrats. I mean, in terms of sort of moderate conservatives, depending on how you want to use those terms. But I feel like the last Democrat to actually win them as a voting bloc arguably was Lyndon Johnson in 1964. And their votes have been up for grabs ever since. Right. Nixon got some of them in 68. They went overwhelmingly for him in 72.
I think Bill Clinton in 92 and maybe lesser 96 was able to kind of get at least even in the white male Southern vote. But of course, he was
I think you're right. The Reagan 84 records are just opening up. So what you're talking about is even more on this side of sort of history than others. Students are always unhappy because they say, why are we ending back in the 70s? Like you got to bring it up to date. Like where are we at today? Right. And I do that, but it's always kind of with an asterisk, like Roger Maris's home run record in 1961, because it's not quite history. And what we're talking about events from 55, 56 years ago. Yeah. And it's probably going to take at least that long to make sense of our current era. I'm not going to be the one that writes that history because I'm living through it. I'm telling my students, you're the ones one day who are maybe even your next generation are the ones who are going to make sense of what's going on today.
Yeah. Well, I think your book is so important in that, Luke, because again, it's about, not just writing the history, right, but uncovering it and examining it, and then showing the world the things that have been that have happened, but the people are still unaware of. And there's a lot more of that to come, obviously, in later eras, as you said, that won't be yours or mine. The book is The Year That Broke Politics, Collusion and Chaos in the Presidential Election of 1968. Luke Nichter, thank you for joining us, and thank you for sharing your insights with us. As always, folks, stay dirty, stay moderate, and stay safe.